He blinked hard, trying to shake himself out of the trance, but the sound persisted, relentless and maddening. The tapping seemed to seep into his bones, reverberating through his body in waves. Each beat grew sharper, until it was no longer just a tap. It was more like something scratching, clawing to get closer. The walls around him felt as if they were closing in, each beat echoing, thickening the silence with a presence he could almost feel. Every time he dared to look away from the screen, he caught the faintest shift of movement at the edge of his vision, something lurking just beyond the circle of light cast by his monitor. But when he tried to focus, there was nothing. Just empty darkness, like the house itself was watching, waiting. He tried to laugh it off, tried to steady his breathing, but it had quickened, falling into step with the rhythm of that sound. The screen's glow seemed to dim, becoming softer, almost distant. The longer he stared, the more he found himself slipping, as though the screen were a portal drawing him into some place vast, silent and unknowable. The tapping stopped, replaced by a different sound, a long, slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the floor, moving closer. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to move, to turn on a light, to snap himself out of whatever strange spell had overtaken him, but he couldn't. It was as though his body had gone slack, every muscle too heavy to lift, his limbs leaden and disconnected from his mind. The dragging sound was closer now, just outside the doorway, pulling him deeper into its rhythm. He felt himself drifting further from reality, his thoughts blurring as he slipped into a strange, trance-like state. His mind floated somewhere between waking and sleep, the boundaries of his thoughts softening, merging with pulsing silence. The beat was inside him now, like a second heartbeat, merging with his own. The last coherent thought he formed in his mind was strange and cold. What if I never wake up from this? As he sat there, locked in place, he felt a strange, tingling sensation spread from the tips of his fingers, a prickling warmth that crept slowly up his hands and wrists, wrapping around his forearms like invisible chains. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but he wasn't reading anymore. The words had long blurred into shifting patterns of light, almost like waves on dark water, rising and falling with that unsteady, insistent beat. The air around him thickened. He could almost taste the stillness, dry and stale, as though the house itself had stopped breathing. Each beat of the sound drifted up from the darkness beyond the doorway, steady, almost soothing, and each with a soft pulse. He felt his mind loosening, unravelling at the edges. It was as though the sound itself was working its way into him, threading through his thoughts, winding deeper into his mind with each insistent tap. He tried to shake his head, to look away, but it was as though his mind had slipped out of alignment with his body. His head felt too heavy, too dense, like it was sinking slowly into his own shoulders. He couldn't lift it. His limbs felt distant, like they belonged to somebody else entirely. The glow of the screen expanded, stretched to fill his vision with an otherworldly light that pulsated in time with the rhythmic tapping, matching his heartbeat, pulling him under. His breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale becoming more laboured, as though something was pressing down on his chest, crushing the air out of his lungs. He felt his eyelids droop, but he couldn't summon the will to blink. The light from the screen had turned off, almost dreamlike, the edges blending into the darkness around him. Shapes began to swim within the glow, shadowy forms that twisted and morphed, their movements fluid, almost mesmerising. They whispered in a language he couldn't understand, each murmur slipping deeper into his consciousness, weaving themselves into the fibres of his mind. He tried to focus, make sense of the patterns, but the shapes only grew darker, more insidious, the whispers growing louder, until they filled his mind, drowning out all other thought. His head felt heavy, his eyes like stone, and his consciousness sank, slipping into the rhythm that echoed through the silence. His own heartbeat had slowed, sinking with the alien pulse, merging with the steady beat of something unknown, something vast, something that had reached into him with cold, invisible hands. And as he slipped further down, he felt his sense of self scattering, his awareness drifting into the dark, his mind dissolving into the rhythm that enveloped him, pulling him under, deeper and deeper. As if moved by some force beyond his control, he rose slowly from his chair, his movements sluggish and dreamlike, as though he were underwater, The air felt dense, pressing against him with a strange weight that he pushed through in slow motion. His gaze drifted upwards, his neck tilted back, his eyes fixed on something invisible, something high above him. The room around him began to blur at the edges, fading from his awareness until he was barely conscious of his surroundings. All he could feel was the pull, soft, magnetic and impossibly strong, tugging at him, urging him upward, higher and higher. His feet seemed to lift ever so slightly from the ground, and he could no longer tell if he was standing, floating, or simply suspended in the thick, dreamlike atmosphere that had settled around him. The ceiling above was gone, replaced by an endless dark void that stretched infinitely, yet felt strangely close. The air grew colder, and with each shallow breath, he felt a chill seep into his lungs, as though he were inhaling the night himself. The rhythmic tapping, that steady beat, echoed now from all sides, rising and falling in perfect time with his own pulse. It filled the empty space around him, resonating through his bones, guiding his body like a slow, silent conductor. He felt weightless, as if his limbs, his mind, his very self were unravelling, drifting away from him into the darkness above. His vision blurred, narrowing until all he could see was the faint outline of that boundless void stretching before him, pulling him deeper into its embrace. The world below, his room, his desk, his computer, had faded into an unimportant, distant memory, and he felt his mind slip further into the trance, slowly losing touch with anything solid, anything familiar. In that timeless moment he was floating, his thoughts swirling like leaves caught in a current, his sense of ebbing away with each beat of that steady, hypnotic pulse. His body, his consciousness, felt like they were dissolving, merging with the vast, endless dark above. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with fragments of thoughts, sensations that weren't his own, foreign and cold, drifting from somewhere unfathomably deep. And as he rose higher, lost in the strange trance-like ascent, he felt a fleeting sense that he was no longer alone. Shadows flickered around him, shifting within the darkness, gathering closer. Watching with his eyes he could feel but not see. As he floated in that strange suspended state, he felt a sudden undeniable awareness, a prickling sensation at the back of his mind, tugging him back into the body, grounding him with a chill that cut through his trance. He wasn't alone. The realization struck with a cold weight of certainty, rooting him in place. There, down below, where he'd just been sitting, was someone else. Something else. He couldn't move his gaze, couldn't turn to see it fully, but he felt it, the pressure of a storm in the air, thick and charged. The chair he'd vacated was no longer empty. He sensed the faintest outline of a figure sitting there, nestled into the spot he'd only moments ago inhabited. They were still, as if studying the screen, with an unsettling patience, breathing in the lingering warmth he'd left behind. The figure was vague, half-formed, blending into the shadows that seemed to pull unnaturally around the chair. Yet he could feel its presence as if it were staring straight through him, aware of every breath, every heartbeat. He strained, willing his mind to focus, to make sense of what he was seeing, but his vision remained clouded, obscured, like he was looking through fogged glass. The sound returned, softer now, more insidious, as though whoever or whatever sat in his chair was tapping, rapping fingers softly against the desk. A faint scratching sound, light and rhythmic, drummed through the air, and he felt it crawl beneath his skin, igniting a deep, bone-cold dread. He tried to focus to see it clearly, but every time his gaze sharpened, the figure seemed to shift, slipping in and out of his vision, fading just as he almost understood its shape. All he could do was make out the impression of a head turned slightly in his direction, as though it too sensed him floating above, and was now looking straight up at him. An icy prick ran down his spine as he felt a heavy awareness settle upon him, locking his gaze in place. The weight of its gaze was unbearable, thick and pressing, a silent force that held him in place. It didn't move, didn't blink, but he felt its stare bore into him, pulling him down as if it were trying to reel him back, pulling him from this strange, weightless state. A faint whisper, not unlike his own voice, but stretched and distorted, brushed through his mind. It wasn't a command, not quite, but an invitation, a terrible suggestion. Come closer, sit with me. and in that moment he knew, with a clarity that made his blood run cold, that if he let himself descend, if he went back to that chair, he wouldn't be the one sitting there anymore. His vision began to warp and shift, as if the darkness around him had a mind of its own, twisting and bending to reveal fragments of something just beyond his grasp. Through the haze he caught a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping through the hallway, quick and silent, before vanishing into the darkness again, his breath hitched, heart pounding with a primal fear that he couldn't fully understand. A figure emerged, just barely visible in the dim light cast from the screen. It was someone standing in the doorway, half shrouded in darkness, features obscured yet hauntingly familiar. He squinted, trying to focus, to make out the details, but the more he tried, the more the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, dissolving like smoke whenever he thought he might catch a glimpse of its face. Yet in those fragmented glances he could see it, a shape, a posture, an unmistakable resemblance. It looked like him. Same build, same hair falling over a slightly hunched shoulder, same quiet, restless stance. But it wasn't him. Not truly. There was something wrong about it. Something hollow. As if it were a mere outline of him, drained of all warmth, all familiarity, its head tilted, just slightly, watching him with an intensity that sent a sharp wave of nausea through his stomach. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate, each step barely disturbing the thick silence, as if it moved closer. The shadows deepened around its face, concealing its eyes, its mouth, as if it wore a mask that shifted each time he tried to truly look at it. Every angle he caught seemed wrong, as if he were seeing himself reflected in a fractured mirror, some distorted, uncanny version that flickered in and out of view. He blinked, and suddenly the figure was gone. A flash of movement flickered through the reflection of his screen. There it was again, drifting soundlessly behind him, slipping into the corners of the room, watching him with predatory stillness. The room grew colder, the chill cutting deep into his bones as he became aware of its breathing. A slow, raspy sound, just out of sync with his own. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he felt the weight of its gaze pressing down upon him. He caught glimpses, its hand brushing against the doorway, fingers curled unnaturally, its shadow gliding along the floor, moving with a grace that felt unsettlingly familiar. It passed by the reflection in his screen, his face obscured, but he caught a fleeting image of a half-smile, a twisted, faintly mocking expression on the edge of what could almost be his own lips. He wanted to turn away, but some dark part of him couldn't help but stare, drawn into those fragments of a face, of his own features mirrored back at him in that strange, distorted way. Each glimpse burned into his mind, a ghostly hollow image of himself, empty-eyed and shadow-bound, flickering in and out of reality, like a memory forgotten and half-remembered, all at once. The figure seemed to sense fear feeding off of it, and its head tilted once more, a slow, calculated movement that sent shivers down his spine. It was as if he were waiting for something, waiting for him to realise what he had already feared, that it had always been there, lurking just beyond his vision, an echo of himself that only came alive in the dark. Driven by an instinct he couldn't fully understand, he forced himself out of his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural, as if some invisible weight were holding him back. Each step felt heavier than the last, a silent protest from deep within his mind, warning him not to go, but he pressed on, driven by a need to see, to confront whatever had taken root in the shadows of his home. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly dark, as if the shadows had thickened and grown, pulsing with an energy that was both familiar and foreign. His footsteps sounded hollow against the floorboards, each creak swallowed almost instantly by the suffocating silence that filled the air. At the end of the hallway, the stairs loomed, disappearing into the pitch blackness of the second floor. As he climbed, each step felt like it took him deeper into a place he didn't recognise, a place that seemed to shift and twist with each passing second. The air grew colder, biting into his skin, and a stale, faintly metallic scent filled his nose, something ancient, untouched, as if the house had closed in on itself, sealing him in. He reached the landing, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, and then he saw it. There, at the far end of the landing, shrouded in the shadow, stood himself. The figure was unmistakable. Same shape, same stance, same weary gaze that seemed to sink deep with fatigue, like he had stared too long into something he could never unsee. But it was wrong, profoundly wrong. His doppelganger stood perfectly still, almost unnaturally so, facing him with a quiet intensity that froze the blood in his veins. The figure was dimly illuminated by the faint spill of moonlight filtering through a nearby window, but its face remained partially in the shadow, revealing only hints of its own features, his mouth set in a faint mocking smile. His eyes, dark hollows that seemed to pull in all the light, as if they led somewhere endless and bleak. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound escaped. His heart thundered in his chest, a frantic beat that echoed in the silence between them. But his body refused to respond, held captive by the eerie familiarity of the figure before him. The figure tilted its head, mirroring him with perfect precision, and then took a sharp step forward, its movements fluid, deliberate. He felt his own body react involuntarily, taking a step back. His mind screamed at him to turn, to run, but his feet were rooted to the floor. The figure's half-lit face shifted slightly, catching the faint light just enough to reveal the smallest details. His own crooked eyebrow, the faint scar on his chin, every detail exactly as he knew it, yet imbued with a lifelessness that sent an icy wave of dread down his spine. And then his doppelganger's mouth began to move, soundlessly at first, forming words that he couldn't quite hear. But slowly, as if drawn by some force beyond his will, he began to make out the faintest whispers, repeating a single phrase over and over, barely more than a breath. "You don't belong here. I do." The words sank deep into his mind, a chilling echo that seemed to come not just from the figure, but from within him, a thought he couldn't quite push away. The doppelganger stepped closer, close enough now that he could see his own face fully, expressionless, cold, the eyes dark and empty, yet watching him with a hunger, a sense of possession that rooted him in place. As he watched, paralysed, the figure stretched out a hand, and he felt a sharp, invisible pull, as if it were drawing something vital from within him, siphoning his strength, his thoughts, even his sense of self. He felt his mind slipping, dissolving into the same hypnotic rhythm that had lulled him at his desk. A deep sinking darkness that dragged him down until he could barely feel his own heartbeat. The doppelganger's hand moved closer, just inches from his face. Fingers were slightly outstretched, ready to take hold, and in that moment a terrible clarity dawned upon him. If he allowed himself to touch that hand, he would lose himself entirely, trapped, erased, with nothing left of him except his hollow, mocking echo that now stood before him. The figure smiled wider, its mouth twisted with the dark satisfaction of a predator closing in on its prey, and its whispered words grew louder, resonating through his mind, filling every corner of his being. "I belong here. You don't." In the dim light he could see his own face reflected back at him, cold and foreign, just as the fragments of himself slipped away, disappearing into the dark. A surge of terror clawed its way up his throat, raw and overpowering, until it broke free in a scream that shattered the silence, echoing down the darkened hall and reverberating through the entire house. It was a scream torn from the deepest part of him, primal and desperate, a last attempt to cling to his own existence. The sound filled the air, almost alien, distorted, as though it were being pulled away from him, swallowed by the darkness before it could even fully escape his lips. The figure inched closer. The shadows around them thickened, pressing down, trapping him in place. He felt his voice dying away, fading as his scream dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the silence, vast and consuming, stretching on without end. His mind began to splinter, each thought unravelling, scattering like dust on the wind, slipping through his grasp no matter what, no matter how hard he tried to hold on. The figure's eyes, his own eyes, watched him with that unsettling calm, the expression empty yet knowing, as if it understood the terror he felt and relished it. As the scream ebbed, the world around him started to blur, his vision narrowing, fading to black at the edges. His last sensations were strange, fragmented, coldness creeping over his skin, the weight of the darkness pressing down, the faint echo of the steady hypnotic beat pulsating in his mind. It was almost soothing now, like a lullaby, drawing him further into that endless dark. The last thing he remembered was the doppelganger's face, staring at him with his own eyes, lips curling into that haunting smile as everything else slipped away, leaving him floating, lost, adrift in the silence, and then nothing. The days that followed were strange, a hazy blur where time seemed to bleed and fold over itself. He'd catch glimpses of things he couldn't remember doing, cups left in odd places, lights flickering on rooms he hadn't entered, and every now and then he felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if something just out of sight was watching him, waiting. He tried to shake off the unease, but an inexplicable heaviness lingered, like the aftermath of a half-remembered nightmare. By the end of the week he could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He hadn't been able to sleep properly, haunted by fragments of memories that made no sense. A fleeting image of the upstairs landing, a sense of cold, his own eyes staring back at him from somewhere in the dark. It was as though his mind was trying to protect him from something he couldn't remember, but needed to understand. One night as he lay awake, he decided to piece together whatever fragments he could. He focused, breathing deeply, letting his mind wander, hoping to find anything that might unlock what had happened. Images began to surface, disconnected and murky, like peering through fogged glass. Shadows shifting in his peripheral vision, a weightless, floating feeling, and a long dark hallway stretching before him. And then the memory hit him with startling clarity. He was lying on the floor, sprawled out in the hallway. Staring up into the dark, he could see himself, his own body lying there, his limbs splayed, eyes wide open, fixated on the ceiling, empty and vacant. His face was pale, lips parted slightly as if he had just gasped his last breath, frozen with a look of horror. But the memory wasn't just of his own body, it was of being there, looking down at himself. He could remember the sense of staring, of observation, his own lifeless form, as though he were a stranger in his own home, hovering just above, watching. He recalled the coldness, the surreal detachment as he looked down upon himself, that gnawing feeling that something, someone else was there, and it was waiting to take his place. As he sat there, the weight of realization crashed over him. He hadn't just seen himself that night, he'd been outside of himself. Detached, lost in the dark, empty silence, and the memory of that feeling, of drifting above his own body, filled him with a dread unlike anything he had ever known. Now he was back in his body, fully grounded in the here and now, but he couldn't shake the suspicion that he had not returned alone. The memory of lying there in the hallway lingered, haunting him even as he tried to shake it off. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his own face staring back up at him, vacant and cold, like some discarded shell. But tonight he tried once more to piece together the fragments. Something new began to surface, a fresh vision, pushing its way into his mind. It began as a flicker, a hazy impression, but then it sharpened, vivid and undeniable. He saw himself standing in the hallway, fists clenched, his face twisted in an expression he didn't recognize. Anger, or maybe desperation, something primal and violent. He watched himself move forward, his eyes fixed on something, or someone, just ahead, and then he saw it clearly. The vision shifted, blurred and distorting, but he could make out the dim figure of another person, someone he didn't know, standing with their back to him, vulnerable, unaware, his own hands reaching out in the vision, grabbing the figure's shoulders, and he watched himself pull them back with force, throwing them on the ground. The stranger's face was a blur, unrecognisable, but the terror in their body language was unmistakable, a pleading, desperate attempt to escape his grasp. He saw his own face again in the vision, dark eyes gleaming with strange intensity, devoid of empathy, focused only on his target. It was as though he were watching a stranger in his own skin, someone who looked like him, but moved with a brutal, almost mechanical determination. The figure pulsed, sharper now, more vivid, and he saw himself pinning the stranger down. His expression twisted, lost to the rage consuming him. He stumbled back from the vision, gasping as though he'd been underwater and had finally come up for air. His hands were trembling, a cold sweat covering his skin. He could still feel the sensation from the vision, the unsettling force of his own strength. the way his hands gripped so tightly they'd left marks. He didn't know who that person was or if they were even real, but the fear he'd felt in the vision, the stranger's helpless struggle, this was burned into his mind. He sank down, shaken, unable to escape the feeling that this was more than just a twisted vision. It was like a memory, a glimpse of something that had actually happened, or perhaps something that was still yet to come. As he sat there, haunted and alone, he couldn't shake the feeling that his own reflection was watching him from somewhere just beyond his sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come forward. The questions spun in his mind, each one bringing a fresh wave of fear and confusion. Was the person in the landing me? He struggled to make sense of it. The vision had been so clear, so visceral, the sight of himself in the hallway, his own hands, his own face, twisted in a mask of violence. But why? And how could he have been both the attacker and the victim? Slowly a terrifying thought took root. Had he somehow attacked himself? The idea was impossible, yet the vision had felt like a memory, raw and undeniable. He remembered his own cold eyes, the strength of his grip, the fear in the other's body. But if that other person was him, then who or what had been the one attacking? A chill crept up his spine as he considered the alternative. What if it wasn't me at all? What if it was something else entirely, something that only wore my face? The entity, if that's what it was, seemed to echo him, mirroring his every move, his very identity, as if it were learning, studying him, inching closer, trying to take his place. His mind flashed back to the moment in the landing when he'd just felt the gaze from the shadows, the sensation that something had been waiting for him, lurking just outside his field of vision. The memory now felt like a warning he hadn't understood. Something had been watching him, wanting to be him. The vision twisted in his mind again, replaying itself in sharp fragments, each more distorted, more nightmarish. He saw himself lying on the floor, eyes empty, lips parted in a silent scream, and the figure above him grinning with his own face, watching him struggle, savouring his fear. It wasn't just some stray thought or vision, he realised. It was something he'd lived, or something he was about to live. Then, almost instinctively, he reached up, brushing his hand against his face, half expecting to feel it twist into that mocking smile, that hollow, lifeless mask he'd seen in the doppelganger. The coldness seeped into his fingers, and he felt strange. The sense of being watched returned, closer this time, as if it were no longer hiding, but rather merging with him, threading itself into his very thoughts. What if that thing, the version of himself in the vision, the one he'd seen in the landing, was not gone at all? He struggled to process what he was seeing. His mind was clouded, slipping further from clarity with every second that passed. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thickening, pressing down on him, rooting him in place. A new dreadful thought had crept into his mind. What if I'm no longer able to leave this room? The weight of the idea settled heavily in his chest, an unbearable pressure that made it hard to breathe. Maybe I'm dead, he thought, the realisation settling over him like a shroud. Maybe I died in the hallway, and this is purgatory. The events of that night unravelled in his memory, replaying with an eerie clarity that had eluded him until now. He remembered the strange hypnotic state he'd fallen into, the flickering visions of himself in the dark, his own face twisted and unfamiliar, the footsteps echoing through the house, the doppelganger lurking in the shadows, taunting him, leading him deeper into fear until he'd lost all sense of himself. It had felt like a nightmare, yet there he was, caught in it, trapped in some strange limbo where he could neither escape nor understand. Then the truth dawned on him, sharp and unyielding, like a knife cutting through the fog of his mind. It was never a separate entity. There had been no haunting, no ghostly figure lurking in the shadows. That other version of him, the one that had felt both foreign and familiar, had been inside him all along, feeding off his fear, twisting his perception until he could no longer recognise himself. It had coaxed him into believing there was another presence, something he could confront, a separate being he could escape from, but it had literally been him. The entity, if it could be called that, had already seeped into his bones, lacing itself through his thoughts, his actions, his fears. It hadn't attacked him, it had made him attack himself. driven by the dark urge that wasn't quite his own. He had struggled against himself in that hallway, trapped in a twisted struggle between who he was and who he was becoming. He felt a terrible coldness spread through him as he tried to grasp this reality. There was no way out, no path back to who he had been before that night. Whatever he'd confronted in the darkness had woven itself into him, pulling him into a silent, endless battle that he could neither win nor escape. He was lost, his own mind his captor, his own shadow his only company, and in that silent, suffocating darkness he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never leave this room again. He was trapped there, the weight of his own room pressing in on him like walls closing in. Everything looked familiar, but wrong. As his gaze shifted from corner to corner, he realised that each time he looked at one part of the room, he would forget what the other parts looked like. It was as though his mind could not hold the entire space at once, as if the room itself was shifting, twisting in subtle ways that left him unsettled and disoriented. The door, his only escape, seemed to drift slightly, inching away each time he blinked. When he tried to focus on it, to memorise its details, it warped again, sometimes too far, sometimes unreachably high. The windows too had changed. They were transparent, showing vague shadows of the world beyond, but felt like walls, thick and impassable, taunting him with the suggestion of freedom just beyond his reach. He pressed his hands into the glass, but it gave nothing in return. Solid and unyielding, as if the very air around him had hardened into a cage. His chest tightened as a new horror dawned upon him. I'm not in my room, not really. I'm trapped in something that's only pretending to be my room. The thought filled him with a deep, hollow dread. Whatever had visited that night, the dark presence that had seeped into his skin, had done more than to haunt him. It had manifested itself, creating a facsimile of life, twisting his surroundings into an eerie reflection of what he'd known. It had taken hold, crept inside his mind, used his own memories against him, and trapped him there, imprisoned for eternity in a place that was both familiar and forever unknowable. Each breath seemed to echo louder, reverberating off unseen walls, and felt closer than before. He could feel the presence still, pulsating within him, woven into his very thoughts, a dark, patient companion, lurking just beneath his skin. It wasn't something he could run from or fight. It was part of him now, a silent jailer that needed no chains or locks. This place, a purgatory, was his mind, twisted into an endless prison, looping over itself, a maze he could never escape. He tried to remember the way his room had once felt, the comforting familiarity, but even those memories were slipping, eroding under the weight of whatever had taken root inside his room. And as the last fragments of life began to fade, replaced by the ever-shifting space around him, he understood the full horror of his sentence. He was alone, in a place that wore his own face, haunted by something that had devoured his soul, locked away in an endless shifting prison, a prisoner of his own mind, his own fear, for eternity.